A word of warning, this podcast explores graphic and disturbing stories and includes some strong language. It therefore may not be suitable for our young listeners or other folks who may find it disturbing. Hello and welcome to a special edition of True Crime News, the podcast. I'm your host, Anna Garcia. Everyone in the world of true crime has a story to tell about a case they worked or lived through. Some are high profile, some you have never heard of, but they are all fascinating. Today's case is about two conmen whose escalating crimes left a trail of victims in their wake. And eventually it led to a cold-blooded murder of a very wealthy art dealer. The charismatic pair masqueraded as real estate moguls, as art dealers, as bankers, even pretending to be royalty, all to scam people. They were able to evade authorities until they committed one crime that they could not con their way out of. Murder. Our guests today are Julie Golden and Kim Kantner, the producers behind the all-new podcast, True Crime News Presents American Hustlers. Julie and Kim, welcome to the program and welcome to True Crime News.
Thank you. Thank you, Anna.
Thanks, Anna.
Yeah, very excited about your podcast. This is a big deal for everyone here at True Crime News, a serial podcast where you really get to tell a story. You know, it's episodic. And that to me is just so exciting. So I mentioned to Julie and Kim before we started, and then, of course, I threatened Will. I said, this is going to be a runaway podcast today. I'm going to let you two take over and tell me a story because it's such an incredible and complicated case, but I will set it up a little bit. And then if you don't mind, I'm just going to ask you questions as we go along like everybody else. Central to this case is a murder. Millionaire socialite who was murdered in Palm Springs on December 7th of 2008. 74-year-old Cliff Lambert. He was first reported missing by a friend. He was a self-made millionaire. He lived a very lavish life. He was also very well known in the gay community. And so it appears that his desire for companionship would lead to his murder. Central to the case still would be Kaushal, Niroula, and Danny Garcia, who somehow formed this criminal partnership, and they went after Cliff. Okay, who wants to start here? Kim, how do we begin to tell this case and this story?
Yeah, I mean, I think based on what you just said, we can start with Cliff and a little bit about how Kaushal and Danny got to him. And then Julie can sort of rewind us to the beginning. And then we'll meet up again at the end, which is kind of how the podcast does. We sort of start with the murder, rewind, get to all the building blocks of it, and then end up back at the murder.
Great.
So Cliff Lambert, everything you said, spot on. Wealthy man, lived in a really nice neighborhood of Palm Springs where, you know, Leonardo DiCaprio had a house, Cher had a house. He was kind of in that neighborhood, had a lovely pool. He lived a great life. He rubbed elbows with a lot of Zsa Zsa Gabor's sisters, and just, you know, had a slew of friends that he would go yachting with and go to Europe with, and really had a colorful, big life here in LA for years, which, he had his art dealership on La Cienega here in Los Angeles. And then when he retired to Palm Springs and loved it, was super happy there. He'd been in a very long-term relationship. His long-term relationship ended, and he did what many do, which is go online to find, you know, friends, partners, what have you. And that is where he came across one Danny Garcia. They met online. Danny flew from the Bay Area of California down to Palm Springs to meet up with Cliff. Their romance did not spark, but and they had such a big age difference, which had nothing to do with that. But Danny kind of endeared himself to Cliff and was helping Cliff with all sorts of things around the house, like, you know, getting all his passwords straight and organizing things on the computer. And if, you know, Cliff needed phone calls to be made or whatever, Danny did them for him, you know, gladly helped him, and was all the time obtaining personal information. He knew who his insurance people were. I'm sure he probably knew his social security number, his bank accounts, where he had money at this particular investment firm. So he was all the while obtaining all that information as he was helping him.
So far we have Danny kind of in the middle of Cliff's life. It's not really a romantic relationship. Is Danny benefiting in any way at this point while he's squirreling away all these passwords and information that will later be useful?
I would say at the moment, what he was benefiting from was a good time. He would go down there and he and Cliff would go to the nice restaurants and sort of wine and dine. And even though they weren't romantically involved, it was still fun. And it was probably good to, get out of San Francisco for a bit here and there and just to be in the Palm Springs environment. So I think it was just an easy, it's a short flight, right? But it's a new place. And he was taken care of really when he was there, and he was in a nice house, and he was, I'm jumping ahead a little bit here, but he was starting to steal things from Cliff. He had antiques, he had artwork. So some of those things went missing. And Cliff also needed help making insurance claims for the things that went missing. So he was benefiting in those ways.
What's the best piece of advice that I ever got about finances? That you're never too young to start saving your money. I remember when my mother took me to the bank to get my first bank account. That forever changed my life. And I think it's so important to remember, even if you're only saving $1 here, $5 there, it can really make a difference in a young person, when you look down the road 10, 20, 30 years. And that brings us to today's sponsor, Acorns. Acorns is a financial wellness app that makes it easy to start saving and investing for your future. You don't need to be an expert. Acorns will recommend a diversified portfolio that fits you and your money goals. You don't need to be rich. Acorns lets you get started with the spare money that you've got right now, even if that's all the spare change you've got. Also, you don't need a ton of time. You can create your Acorns account and start investing in just 5 minutes. I know that investing can seem overwhelming. It's easy to say, oh, I'll do it down the road. But taking charge of your future now is important. And with Acorns, it's easy to do. Sign up now and join the over 13 million all-time customers who have already saved and invested over $22 billion with Acorns. Head to acorns.com/truecrime or download the Acorns app to get started. Paid non-client endorsement compensation provides incentive to positively promote Acorns. Tier 1 compensation provided. Investing involves risk. Acorns Advisors LLC, an SEC-registered investment advisor. View important disclosures at acorn.com/truecrime. So at this point, we have this relationship developing. Don't know how else to describe it other than opportunistic. And we've got Cliff and Danny in the picture, and stuff is starting to disappear. And I guess Danny's been swiping some of Cliff's valuable antiques. So where does Kaushal come into this con? And had the con started yet?
So I think just to take a step back, big picture, which we have to do a lot with this story, even for ourselves, because this whole thing is like a Russian doll and it never ends. I mean, it's which is amazing, but it definitely get confusing. Danny was nibbling away at micro cons at Cliff Lambert. It wasn't till Kaushal came into the picture and had this much bigger con, which would end in murder. That's when things really escalated. So to your point, Anna, how did Kaushal and Danny even meet? Kaushal met Danny back in 2003, around October 20th. It was right after a People magazine article appeared about a lawsuit between Danny Garcia, another plaintiff, and Thomas White, a wealthy philanthropist in San Francisco. There was a major settlement made. Danny scored some major bucks. Kaushal essentially saw that money, thought interesting, and supposedly, well, I don't think it was by chance, they had a meet cute in which Danny's going down one escalator and Kaushal's going down another. But Kaushal, I think, clearly planned it and was targeting Danny. Now, at the time, I don't know if he just saw a mark in Danny, like, ooh, money, I'm going to get that money from him, or a potential partner. But a fast friendship developed, and I think game recognized game. And it was not long before they were pulling off a multitude of cons together.
So, Julie, do you think that Kaushal and Danny, besides partnering up for these cons, did they actually have a relationship themselves?
I think it was just an incredibly dysfunctional, like BFF friendship, where they both respected one another, but they were competing with one another and they wanted what the other person had. I think they just saw useful, I don't want to say fools, but they saw use in each of them. And I have to imagine, Kim and I have talked about this. I suppose once you are a criminal and you're pulling cons and you need a team, there's kind of a forced intimacy, right? Because those are the people you can talk to. So they did hold one another's secrets, which did not go so well as time moved on, as you will hear about.
Interesting. So when they meet and they form this bond and this business partnership of cons, who was the driver? I'm trying to understand their relationship before we get back to Cliff.
That is the interesting thing. I mean, my opinion, Kaushal is definitely the driver. Kim, I don't know if you would agree with that.
I agree. I do think occasionally Danny got in the driver's seat, but for short trips, whereas Kaushal was in the driver's seat for the long haul. And I also, one thing to go back to is insofar as their relationship, their personal relationship, everything we've been, everyone that we interviewed, which is a lot of people for this entire series, we asked that question, and categorically across the board, people said no, they did not have a romantic relationship. I believe from people I spoke to that Kaushal would have wanted to have, and maybe was pining for Danny all along. But I don't think Danny just wasn't that into him in that way. But I do think that Kaushal was pining for him and would have probably had a relationship if Danny would have gone along with it, but he didn't.
What would you say was the biggest con that the two of them, Kaushal and Danny, pulled off?
Monetarily speaking?
However you want to categorize it.
Well, I think consequences and monetarily speaking, it would have been the murder of Cliff Lambert, because they attempted to sell his house in Palm Springs. They drained every bank account and investment account he had. They stole his Louis Vuitton luggage, his Louis Vuitton slippers,
not the slippers.
The slippers. The slippers went.
I don't understand. Like, explain to me. I don't know. Maybe those are expensive slippers, but that seems to be like, really? Unless they were so valuable?
I think somebody just wanted them. I don't think they were going to hawk them on eBay. I think somebody was just going to sport his slippers.
Wow.
I don't know. I can't obviously speak for them, but yeah, I don't think that was a sale item. I think that was a personal.
Aspirational wealth. They really wanted to look like they were the shit.
Wow.
And I think they were more enamored with money than any kind of sex, in terms of priorities. So even if he did have like a thing for Danny, at the end of the day, the sexiest item at the buffet was money and power.
For sure.
So, okay, now explain to us how this became the con, how Cliff became the target. Because up until this point, we have Danny developing a relationship with Cliff. We know that Danny and Kaushal have all their other cons, I guess, going on. So how does everything then focus on Cliff Lambert, and what is the con and the goal?
So from everyone we've spoken to, we believe the original con on Cliff was going to be to kidnap him, take him to Mexico, have him end up in jail or indisposed for some reason down in Mexico, and then go back to the States and steal all of his stuff. We do not believe their original intention was to murder him. However, that all changed when they gathered some other people along for the ride, showed up at Cliff's house, and were like, we're not going to be able to get this guy down to Mexico. We're not going to be able to, this is a bad plan. We're going to have to kill him. So it was not a well thought out plan, which is many of their cons. They seem extravagant but then at the end of the it's like, well, now what are you going to do? And there was no answer to that. So the now what do you do for Cliff was, well, we got to kill him.
But why do you have to kill Cliff?
Well, so not to go down another rabbit hole, but they had in their past sent another person that they had done some business with to Mexico on a little bit of a goose chase, and they needed him out of the way because he was about to out them on some other crimes. They put drugs in his baggage, sent the police, which they knew from all of their, from the Thomas White thing. They had a lot of connections in Mexico from all of that. The police busted this guy on drugs and he was in jail in Mexico. Another gentleman that I won't clog everybody's memory banks with another name that we don't need to know right now. So they had successfully done this, gotten somebody jailed in Mexico. And so that was their plan with Cliff. It's like, oh, we're just going to do that, V2 of that plan. But then whatever, but we don't know, right? Because they're not going to tell us. But whatever just made them decide that Cliff, I think the bottom line was Cliff had too many friends and too many people that were, that knew what he was up to and knew who his friends were. And his friends had met Danny. So I think they just felt he was too connected to the community to just up and vanish and have people not call the police, which is exactly true because they did. Whereas this other guy was a little more on the fringe and didn't have, kind of the connections in the States that would be like, where did he go? Whereas Cliff did. So I think they were just like, man, if he goes missing, somebody's going to actually find him in Mexico and he's going to actually find his way out. Whereas the other guy didn't have those resources. So I believe that's where they switched their plan from, we can't do kidnap, send to Mexico plan. We need to kill him if we want all of this stuff.
So who killed Cliff and how did they kill him?
So Kaushal befriended a gentleman who was a bouncer in a bar in the Castro named Miguel Bustamante. Miguel's roommate named Craig McCarthy also went with Miguel and Kaushal to Palm Springs. Craig was told that he was going to help move furniture. Miguel knew what the plan was, but that no one told Craig. But once they got down there, it became clear that this was going to be a lot more violent than moving furniture. And at that point, Craig didn't back out. Nobody backed out. They were all down there and they all needed money. They all needed money, and desperate people find desperate people and you do desperate things. And that's exactly what happened in all of this. Everybody needed money and they smelled a payday. And so to answer your question, Kaushal befriended Cliff through Danny, got an introduction, befriended Cliff, took Cliff to dinner, wined and dined Cliff, which is not, usually it's the other shoes on the other foot. Cliff is kind of doing the whining and dining and taking care of. Well, now Kaushal swoops in, he's dressed to the nines. He claims he flew in on a private jet. He claims all these things. And he's like, let me take you to dinner. And P.S., I met this, or I'm involved with this lawyer who has a lot of money that's going to come your way. I just need you to sign some documents. So he was also trying to con Cliff with this stupid scam, which Cliff did not believe, mind you, but he was just like, I'll go to dinner with this guy. Let's see what he has to say. So they met up that way. And when they came back from dinner, Craig and Miguel were in the garage and Kaushal opened a sliding glass door once he was in the house with Cliff, let them in, and Craig basically put a chokehold on Cliff and Miguel stabbed him to death right there in his own kitchen with his own kitchen knife.
And what did they do with Cliff, with his body?
They wrapped him up in sheet or rug or something, put him in his own Mercedes and drove his body up the 5 freeway over the Grapevine and then dumped his body off the 5 freeway about 5 or 10 miles. And it wasn't found for many, many years.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay. So Cliff goes missing.
Cliff goes missing.
What happens next?
his friends go ballistic. So here's the kicker. So the night that Cliff's friends noticed he was missing, which was the next day, Cliff was a huge Christmas fan, like decorated his house crazy, had parties. He loved the holidays. So the next night there was a Christmas parade in Palm Springs.
Oh, I love that Christmas parade. It's one of my favorites.
Yeah.
Oh my God. It's the best little town Christmas parade ever.
Yeah, I've seen pictures of it. It's super funky. Tractors with lights all over it. I'm like,
I love it. Even the Stroke Recovery Center has a float. I'm like, only in Palm Springs. I love this Christmas parade. I'm sorry. Go on.
You and Cliff.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
You, the two of you together would have enjoyed yourself. So he loved this parade. He's never missed it. So he's had plans to meet up with his friends at the parade, and he was a no-show. And they were like, well, A, why wouldn't he text? Like, okay, fine. Maybe he wasn't feeling well. He didn't answer. He didn't text and say, I'm not going. He didn't answer any texts that the friends that he was supposed to meet sent him, like, where are you? So they got concerned and they drove to his house that night, which was, the next night, but they didn't know that. So that night after the parade, two of his friends drove to his house. They knew where the key was. They let themselves in, but they saw some evidence of, there was a mixed drink glass on the coffee table. There was some stuff. So they were like, okay, it doesn't, nothing's in shambles. He hasn't been robbed. There's a car's missing, right? So they're like, okay, maybe he went somewhere. So they left, quietly went out, and they're like, okay, I guess everything's fine. But 2 days later, when there was still no word from him, straight to the police. File a missing persons report. And then the police started hunting and pecking around. Obviously he's a grown man, so he has he's able-bodied. He's not a minor. He can go wherever he wants, whenever he wants. There is a car missing. They ran reports on the car. Did it come up stolen? Is it, was it burned up in a ditch or whatever? Nope.
Also just a little bit of context here. It's 2008. You don't have the level of security cameras and surveillance cameras that we have now, whereas you could have done a license plate reading now and maybe have realized, hold on a second, here's where the car was last seen. So it's really important because a lot of times I think when we look at crimes, we always think of it from the perspective of the technology we have available now, and you did not in 2008.
For sure. Yeah, it's a really good way. They didn't. It was, detectives shaking trees and making phone calls and hoping they got a lead.
And by the way, when we began this process, Anna, there was still no body found.
Yeah.
Oh, when you started working on the podcast,
correct.
Cliff hadn't been found?
Yeah.
Cliff's friends are suspicious, but police do they call police and file a missing persons report, or do police say, look, he's an adult, he took his car, he's gone?
A little bit of all of the above, but yes, they drove straight to the police station. They didn't call, sat down with the detective, filed a missing persons report, within 2 days of Cliff being murdered, which again, they didn't know he was at that point, but in 2 days of not hearing from him, they drove straight to the police report. They're like, this is not like him. This is not how he rolls. Something's up. And they're like, okay, so they took the report and started to do their due diligence, right? Started looking, was the car in a ditch? Was it this? Was it that? They went to the house, looked around, see if anything looked funky. It didn't. His dog was gone, so they're like, well, he's gone, his dog's gone, and his car's gone. That's not that suspicious. Looks like he went somewhere. But they still were interviewing people and going around town and doing their thing. And then it escalated when Cliff's neighbors saw a U-Haul in front of Cliff's house being loaded with all of Cliff's things. And of course, his neighbors knew he was missing and hadn't been around for a while. So when they saw the U-Haul, they called 911. So now the police are like, ruh-roh. So they sent a bunch of people there, and the driver of that particular U-Haul was Miguel Bustamante, who was the guy that stabbed Cliff to death with his own kitchen knife in his own kitchen. So that is where things started to unravel. because Miguel was, brought into this murder at a very late part of all of this and wasn't about to go down solo.
So before the U-Haul and the police get called back in, had Danny and Kaushal been able to steal any of the assets that belonged to Cliff?
Yes, tons of them. I mean, again, because Danny had all of his bank account information and his Charles Schwab investment information and all of that, Danny and Kaushal went back to San Francisco, and with the help of David Replogle being a lawyer and knowing all the legalese and how you need to change power of attorney and we need to go notarize. And David Replogle actually posed as Cliff Lambert when things were getting notarized. He was about the same age, not really the same height, but was close enough that, with the driver's license picture, which are kind of shoddy anyway, and the size of your thumb, who's really oh, you don't have the same nose as this guy. So yeah, with David Replogle's legalese and standing in for Cliff, things got notarized and they wiped Cliff clean. And we're in the process of trying to sell his house through a real estate connection that Kaushal had with a guy named Mark Evans. And Mark Evans is the other reason that the domino, on the heels of the U-Haul, Mark Evans was looking into this house that Kaushal's oh, we want to fire sale this thing. It's worth, whatever it's worth, but we want to sell it for half that. And Mark was like, well, that's weird. So he had a friend of his do a title check on the house, found out who the owner was. She did a quick search and was like, this guy's missing. So a small article had been written up in the Palm Springs newspaper, the Desert Springs?
The Desert Sun, is it?
Desert Sun. There we go. I used to have a subscription and be reading that thing every day, and now it's out of my head. So yeah, so a small article had been written in the Desert Sun about Cliff's disappearance, and the woman who did the title check on the house saw that, called Mark Evans and said, yo, this guy's missing, so this is very suspect. So on the heels of that, Mark also called 911, Palm Springs police, and was like, I got some guys up here in San Francisco that are trying to fire sale that missing dude's house. You guys may want to look into this. So it really, the house of cards, started to fall pretty rapidly on the heels of the U-Haul and Mark Evans calling 911.
So when do people get arrested and charged?
It took months to actually get everyone arrested. Kaushal, they ended up nabbing at a different court date they knew he had for a immigration charge, because ICE was after him because his long ago scam about giving $1 million to the college never came to be. And then he was in the United States illegally. So ICE was after him. So he had a court date for ICE. So Kaushal and David Replogle showed up together for that court date. Both of them got nabbed at the courthouse. So now you have Miguel, Kaushal, and David behind bars. And Craig McCarthy went next, and Danny was last. And Danny, they ended up finding hiding behind, right, Julie? Wasn't it hiding behind a water heater? I think in someone's house, crunched down and waiting. So it took months, but they did finally arrest everyone.
So where's the justice here? Were there convictions? What happened?
They did 2 trials. First of all, Craig McCarthy pled guilty for a lenient sentence. He was so guilt-ridden. Again, he came in thinking he was moving furniture and ended up holding a guy in a chokehold who got murdered. And he was like, what the heck? So he had a very guilty conscience. He was not a criminal. He was, in the armed forces. He was leading he was in college. He was trying to just put the pieces of his life together. So once the police found him and interrogated him, he didn't even hold back. He was like, we killed him. This person that's it named everybody. So he pled guilty, took a lighter sentence than life without parole. So they had him and, to testify against everybody, and he knew exactly how everything went down because he was there. So he pled guilty. The other 4, they paired up. So Miguel and David Replogle, they tried together first, and then Kaushal and Danny, they tried together second. So David Replogle and Miguel Bustamante both went to trial, both were convicted of first-degree murder, and both got, obviously, automatic life without parole because it's here in California. About a year later, Danny and Kaushal go on trial. They also get convicted of first-degree murder. They also get life without parole. However, during their trial, because Danny was like the IT guru that we talked about earlier, he had all the computer skills, and because they had, both Kaushal and Danny had chosen to represent themselves in court, the courts gave them Mac laptops to prepare for trial on. Well, Danny had enabled his Mac laptop to record everything that was going on in court, unbeknownst to everybody else. He was also recording when they were at recess. So during a recess, Danny's computer is recording. The judge is having what he thinks is a private conversation in his own courtroom with his court reporter. And he mentions some
that he hears that Kaushal has HIV, that he's HIV positive, and he says something disparaging about that.
Yeah. The judge does.
Correct.
Yes.
Correct. So now that's illegally recorded on Danny's laptop, but Danny hears the recording and goes in judge's chambers and says, hey, you're biased against Kaushal and I. Listen to these things you said. And he said, forget about that. I have a freedom of speech. Forget about it. So they did. And the trial continued, and they got convicted, and they got life without parole. But they obviously filed an appeal based on these recordings. Now, that took from 2012, almost 10 years to get through all the appeals process and for them to be granted. And again, this happened when Julie and I were doing this podcast that we think is ancient, that these guys are already like convicted in life without parole, right? But nope. So in the middle of us doing this podcast, a long story short, but a reporter in Palm Springs got wind of who we've interviewed for the series, got wind of this trial. And she was like, have you heard of this? And I was like, no. So they all were retried within the last couple of years. Again, David and Miguel reconvicted, first degree murder, life without parole. Kaushal and Danny both reconvicted, first degree murder, and then in the meantime, Kaushal got murdered in prison.
How did he get murdered in prison?
His cellmate.
What? I'm sorry?
His cellmate.
His cellmate.
Why did his cellmate kill him? How did he kill him?
We don't have the details on that, and they haven't actually released the details on how he murdered him, but it was in the cell. It wasn't like in a hallway or in the lunch line or in the gym or in the yard. It was actually in their cell. So whatever, did he have a shank? Did he strangle him with his bed sheets? Did he?
And his cellmate, Kim, I'm trying to remember, he was a violent offender, right? It was kind of questionable why they even put him in the cell with him. I'm trying to remember.
Yeah, he was in there for sexual assault charges.
Okay.
Yeah. So he got murdered also, maybe 2 years ago. So now Danny is the only one that has not been sentenced. And he keeps stalling in the courts, trying to get yet another trial, claiming his counsel, didn't do him justice, blah, 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 blah. So Danny is the only one that hasn't been sentenced, but they've all been reconvicted. Everybody's been reconvicted, first degree murder, life without parole, just waiting for the sentencing.
But there was a moment where I, again, fully regretted that I agreed to do this podcast, because I was like, are these guys getting out of jail? Like, this is just supposed to be some ancient story that we're digging into. Kim was excited. I was terrified. That's kind of how we roll.
So forgive me, because this is a lot and an incredibly complicated series of cases within one umbrella murder here. Was justice served?
I mean, as good as it gets here, I believe so. I do. I mean, what more can you do? I mean, all of their victims were innocent. None of them deserved any of this. They were all conned or scammed or killed. All of them. And so, I mean, yeah, you can't do anything else except put these guys in jail for life. And that's where they are, except for Kaushal, who's now no longer with us.
Justice was served for the murder of Cliff Lambert. Justice was not served for the multitude of other cons and crimes that they pulled off. There are people still digging themselves out financially from what they were subjected to by these guys, and they'll never be made whole.
Wow. I think, for me, one of the questions that still remains is, how do you go from fairly successful conmen, right? They're able to pull off the con, and then you get to a point where it goes to murder. Because a lot of times, people stay in their lanes. And this one seems like something went very, very wrong here with the con.
Well, also, if you listen to Miguel took the police back to the scene of the crime, and Craig McCarthy took the police back to the scene of the crime, and there's audio of this, and he walks them through the whole thing. And when he describes Kaushal just standing there, like emotionless, feeling nothing, it's not like a whole person suddenly became a murderer. So to your point, Anna, it's almost like he had this brewing in him the whole time.
Interesting.
I agree.
Wow.
I don't think he was just like a con man that went rogue. I think he always had this in him, and I don't think he cared at all.
What about Danny? Was Danny equally as dark?
Depends who you ask.
Yeah.
If you ask the women that co-wrote the book, it's interesting how sympathetic they are towards Danny.
Interesting.
If you ask the lawyer who represented Thomas White against Danny, he said he's never met such a scary sociopath than Danny Garcia.
And if you ask Tyson Wrench, who had a friendship and was also victimized by Danny, if you ask him, he fully believes Danny got what he deserved and also is a sociopath. So yeah, I don't think it was murdering Cliff was something that kept either Kaushal or Danny up at night.
Yeah. How sad. It's just so awful to have so many, many victims, and the ability to keep the cons going, over all these years. It's horrific. So Julie and Kim, your podcast dedicated to telling all of these cases in episodes. Tell us a little bit more about where people can find this, and are you dropping an episode a week? How's that working?
New episodes drop every Monday.
Amazing. Wow. I feel like you two just have totally lived all of these crimes and the production of this podcast for a very long time.
We have.
Yeah. We've been through COVID through this, wildfires. Well, I guess we're already done with that. It's definitely a part of our DNA at this point.
Yeah. Amazing. Well, thank you so much, Julie and Kim. Fascinating, so complicated. Love a good deep dive. For those of you who really want to understand this case and its complexities in its totality, I recommend that you listen to True Crime News Presents American Hustlers, which is available wherever you all get your podcasts. And we thank you so much. This is great. I wish you much success. Thank you for sharing so much time with us today. This is True Crime News, the podcast. I'm your host, Anna Garcia, and we'll see you next time, everyone.
Thank you so much, Anna.
Thanks, Anna.